Great. Will somebody let us know when we're live?
You're live now.
Oh, terrific. Great. Welcome, everyone. My name's Seth Schultz, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the Resilience First Fringe event with Innovate for Cities. We've got a great panel and discussion lined up, particularly on city and business leaders, the virtual roundtable that we're hosting. And as I said, in the margins of the Innovate for Cities conference, which has been going on all week, very exciting, all over the world. I think we've got 5,000-6,000 people logged on with over 100 partners through this event. So kudos to the Global Covenant of Mayors and UN Habitat, as well as the IPCC for hosting the Innovate for Cities. And Resilience First is extremely excited to have been a sponsor for this conference for the week and for bringing us all together today to talk about building resilient cities and accelerating implementation. So we've got some great lineup of speakers. I'll give you a little bit of an overview, kind of set the table, so to speak, and then I want to whiz us around it and hear from some of the panelists and their perspectives. There's a richness here of diversity of thought, and then we'll engage that and have a little bit of discussion at the end through some Q&As. Throughout this, hopefully everybody's very, very familiar after a year and a half of working virtually, and understands the platform. We've got a chat function. We've got some folks monitoring that, and I'll look to bring those into conversation. So in brief, as I mentioned, the Resilience Shift is in partnership with UN Habitat and GCOM on convening city leaders and businesses, but particularly around action solutions and frameworks that are required to advance the building of resilient cities in their communities. And in particular, we thought, given the coronavirus pandemic, accelerating unanticipated changes in cities across the world, resulting in the various strains and stresses in the way cities operate, but also fast tracking in some cases, efficiencies in other areas. The pandemic has also served to shine a light on the great inequalities across our cities, as well as identified areas for investment and training. Learnings from our approach to handling the pandemic across cities should be reflected on and considered as we prepare our cities to adapt to the growing threats of climate change. So a lot of lessons and analogies can be learned and gained from what we've seen happen with the pandemic to what's been going on with climate change. There's been a number of organizations, some of which are represented on this call, who have been doing some thought leadership and research on this very topic, which has got some illuminating results. But in particular, the community, the place-based connection is at the very heart of resilience. And we've seen that in terms of the different responses. It's been fascinating about the pandemic, because it's the same in terms of a kind of a resilience perspective. It's the same hazard affecting people. What's different about it is the readiness with which that area has been affected and the capacity that was there, but it's the same issue. So look consistently across the world of how people have responded in the face of the same thing. It doesn't usually happen, right? If you have a hurricane, different intensity, different time, and it's very, very specific. Coronavirus has been everywhere. So through this kind of roundtable that we pulled together, we want to talk through and understand more of this, pull on some of the sessions that we've already been hearing about across the Innovate for Cities conference, and then also in consideration with the IPCC Working Group 1 report that came out earlier, again, continuing to highlight the amount of time that we have, which is ever shortening. So with that, I'd like to get into a quick introduction of some of our panelists. I'm going to call on each of you, and if you could just please say a few words introducing yourself, that would be great. First of all, I'd like to introduce Andy Deacon, who is the acting managing director of the Global Covenant of Mayors. Andy, if you could just introduce yourself briefly, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the panel. So Andy Deacon, Acting Managing Director for the Global Covenant of Mayors team, working across a range of our programs from research and innovation to data to finance and investment, and looking forward to bringing some of those perspectives to the panel discussion. Have a background both in supporting cities, but also briefly in central government, heading up the climate resilience team for UK government many years ago now, but some great perspectives to be able to draw on.
Thanks so much, Andy, and kudos to you and your organization for everything you're doing this week with Innovate for Cities. It's really amazing, and we're delighted that you're here with us today. Jean Devlin is a partner at Control Risk. Could you please say hi and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone, and it's great to be here as part of the discussion. As Seth mentioned, I'm a partner based in London at Control Risks. We're a specialist risk consultancy. We've been around for about 50 years or so, and we work with all types and size of businesses around the world, from institutional investors, as well as infrastructure projects, all types of corporates. And I'm really kind of looking forward, I think, to bringing the perspective on what risk and resilience really means for different types of businesses, and where there's kind of common challenges that can be, hopefully kind of addressed as part of this conversation.
Fantastic, Jean. Thanks so much for being here. And if we could have Jeremy Goldberg, who's the Worldwide Director of Critical Infrastructure at Microsoft. Are you here? Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, Seth. Greetings from New York. The sun's not even up yet. Thrilled to be here.
Thanks for, yeah.
No, really, really wonderful to join everyone. So I am the Worldwide Director of Critical Infrastructure at Microsoft. Previously held positions in government. Most recently was the state CIO of New York, and during the first wave of the COVID pandemic. And prior to that, served in 3 mayor's offices in New York City, San Francisco, and the city of San Jose. So I bring to Microsoft and to this discussion the view and the experience of a former customer, a resident of those cities, and someone who's really engaged in the sustainability and resilience efforts in cities. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining, Jeremy. And we were kind of kidding the other day because I'm also a New Yorker, but I happen to be in London for this. So Jeremy is the one who drew the short straw and had to wake up extra early. But thanks for being here. And last but certainly not least, good friend and partner Peter Hall, who's the Global Director of the Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure at Wood. Peter, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. And I also do a short straw. I'm in Portland, Maine, so it's dark here too. But I've been up for a while and I'm ready to go. So thanks everyone. And I'm the Vice President and Global Director for Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure at Wood, which is a large engineering firm building critical infrastructures projects around the world. And in my role, which I've had for a few years now, basically getting resilience and sustainability into our infrastructure projects and working closely with businesses. And as part of that, also lead a partnership with the Resilient Cities Network. And before that, 100 RC. So I've been in the cities world for a number of years, and also work closely with the Resilient Shift and Seth and support the ICSI group action tracks, working with Andy and others. And then in the last year, I've also been seconded into the Race to Resilience, leading the business engagement work, which has been really great work and aligning a lot of what we're doing at Wood. So thanks again. Pleasure to join the panel.
Thank you. And without further ado, I want to kind of just jump right into things and have a kind of a freewheeling conversation and prompt. I think a few of you might have some content and slides to share, if I understand correctly. So for those that do, I believe is that Jeremy, that's you, and that is Andy. Is that correct? Yeah. So what I might,
and me as well, people. So
yeah. So I might go to those first, so we can have some of that content, and then have a discussion kind of be more broadly through that. So maybe first, Andy, could I come to you first as the host of Innovate for Cities and everything that you're doing, and hear a little bit about you, what you think is happening with regards to the science that I just mentioned, the IPCC. The thrust behind the Global Covenant of Mayors working on innovation as it pertains to research, but what this all means for cities and how it's supposed to be or can be applicable at the scale of local government. So Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Seth. And I've got just, it's about 4 or 5 slides, so shouldn't take too long. So firstly, to say that an enormous wealth of data from all of the reporting that global covenant cities are doing, and we're really looking to use that to start to increase any focus on driving action. So this graphic that you see here is from our previous impact aggregation report from COP in 2019. Work with a consultancy team from Arup to then draw together and pull together. This is cities' own reporting of hazard data, kind of, and as perceived by them in terms of main hazards that are faced. And there's an enormous wealth of data here. So breakdowns by region, by types of hazard. But you'll see there's really everything in there, from very short-term floods, to extreme heat, to airborne and waterborne disease exposure, to fires, and so on. And so what came through loud and clear is that cities really are on the front line. And I'll say a bit more in a few moments about the cities component of race to resilience. But the Global Covenant has been doing a lot of work to kind of integrate resilience planning as a key pillar of activity, but to have that informed by data. And we will be updating this research from the latest round of city reporting, and we'll be launching an updated version of this, as well as emissions reduction data, during COP26 in Glasgow in just a few weeks' time. The analysis isn't quite ready yet, and we weren't going to let it out the door yet. We're keeping our powder dry for Glasgow, but there will be an update on city reporting on hazard. And then, as you mentioned, fantastic work from the IPCC, and Seth, you'll know we've been talking with your team just about this and opportunities that might be there to build on the latest IPCC assessment report. You'll have heard from others during the course of the week. That report, Working Group 1's assessment released in August, described as Code Red for humanity, but really now starting to get into the details. So you can go now to the IPCC website, look for the interactive atlas, and start to find regional synthesis reports, again, 4 different types of climate hazard on the basis of the IPCC assessment. And again, multiple model runs, taking account of different factors, multiple risks and hazards that are then starting to be mapped at regional level by the IPCC, as you'll see here, with reporting on the observed trends, and then with reporting of basically attribution levels of the links back to climate change as the driver for this. So I've chosen the extreme heat map here, but you can go in and spend hours, if you like this kind of thing, playing with the data. And in case it's not obvious, that's a regional map of the world, just with the kind of different hexagons on, then showing the particular trend that's been selected, but accessed through their website to an enormous amount of data. And that will get you kind of so far. And I'll say a little bit more about some other regional research that GCOM conducted earlier this year and through 2020 in just a moment. But effectively, I mean, really to bring it down to city level. So then we have some exciting new work underway with the World Resources Institute that's starting to get down to visualizing hazards at individual neighborhood or even kind of point data level, and starting to think about how we match an understanding, for example, of key civic or public health amenities, how we're able to then bring in hazard spatial distribution mapping on top of that, and really then start to get to key exposure spatial distribution statistics, and to really understand resilience building and responses at city scale. This kind of data is going to be absolutely crucial in the coming years. We're beyond just talking in generalities about the way that individual climate risks or hazards are going to impact cities. That understanding and reporting is coming through from cities themselves, but really now starting to understand where the key pinch points and risks lie in order to start to build appropriate responses. And mayors and other city leaders will have a key role in that. And we've seen that this summer in everything from the way that wildfires in Europe have started to approach cities and become more of an issue. And now across national boundaries, individual groupings of cities coming together to respond, to work around the world in response to coastal and other flash flooding events, kind of two very separate sets of drivers for that. But again, we've seen both of those coming together, and mayors being on the front line of the response to those hazards and the way that they're impacting individual cities. So this is only at prototype stage and a lot more work to do, but we are starting to get to the stage of being able to downscale data to be able to respond. And I'll paste the link in the chat to this. Some very interesting, again, regional research, but drawing on understanding from individual cities that Kathy Oak, Paris Hadfield, and others in the Connected Cities Lab at the University of Melbourne, working as advisors to GCOM's research and innovation program, had then pulled together a set of keyword searches that were looking across city hazard reporting, as well as in this case also emissions reduction data, but to draw out key information about city planning and interventions. And you'll see there kind of links to, again, public health and welfare, to investment and finance. And I think those are themes that we might want to come back to during discussion, just in terms of planning the city scale adaptation response. And in terms of the way that links to the COVID-19 pandemic, then I've started to pull together a taxonomy of city emergency responses to COVID-19. Again, through this is keyword searching of city climate responses, then backed up by some individual interview data as well, but really across governance, across research and knowledge, across infrastructure and technology and economic development, a key set of factors that cities are saying form an important part of their response to the global COVID-19 pandemic, but where there are then crossovers in pretty much all of these cases, then also with responses to climate change. And thank you for your organization's contribution through this week to being able to pull together the program and your support for Innovate for Cities. But really, we're looking to use that to drive an updated and reformatted global research and action agenda on cities and climate science, and the resilience and adaptation response from city scale needs to be an important part of that. And we're looking to evolve that research and action agenda and to continue to drive work with cities forward through the Innovate for Cities ongoing program, the work of our Research and Innovation Technical Working Group that involves multiple of our regional and national covenants, key city network partners, and other players, including event co-host UN Habitat, and then looking to drive that forward in coming years. Final slide. Then just to bring it all together, previously that GCOM aggregation work, then also building on the work of the Coalition for Urban Transitions and others, made it very clear that then basically national governments can unlock urban opportunity, but there are some key barriers in the way to doing that. We have further country level analysis being published with CUT alongside their event in Brazil later this month, but that covering multiple countries that are really on the front lines of climate change, and multi-level governance and the way in which we look to bring that city scale response together with the response from national government, business and others really important. And the city's race to resilience is providing one mechanism to do that. There will be updates at COP26 on the races, and I will no doubt hear from yourself and others during the course of this discussion about that. But the way in which cities are not just kind of committing overall, but then pledging to individual actions and ongoing reporting will be an important component of the resilience response. So I hope that helps to set a little bit of the context, some key programs that we and other partners are engaged in, and just helps to set the scene a bit for what I hope is a very lively and informative discussion. Back to you, Seth.
Well, thanks so much, Andy. It certainly did. Really kind of a remarkable breadth of activities that you're doing and trying to pull together and harness the various communities. And I think it illustrates why you are behind and pushing forward the Innovate for Cities more broadly and how it all comes together. So thank you very much for that presentation. Fantastic. Instead of going, I'm going to hold fire on questions, and we're going to hear from each of the panelists and from their perspectives, and then we'll come back to a cross-cutting Q&A. So thanks again for that, Andy. Next, I'd like to go to Jeremy and hear a little bit from that broader landscape that Andy was just describing. To more about, Andy was talking about some of the knowledge and the translation and harnessing it, but actually from your perspective, Jeremy, how to actually, implement that in a particular city and the struggles and opportunities that exist either across government and or the private sector where you're now at. So very much looking to hear from you, Jeremy, and over to you.
Sure. I'm not as familiar with Zoom these days, so I'm hoping that you see my screen.
We got it up. It's working.
So if I fumble, my apologies.
Is that your public announcement now that you're a Microsoft guy about Teams?
I don't know. So I'll appreciate the setup and really a really thoughtful, remarkable research and work that you're doing, Andy. Really, really prolific stuff there. And so, I like to show this slide, more as like sort of the backdrop and the context of all of this related to critical infrastructure, something that I am very passionate about. And as I mentioned, I bring to this discussion and to Microsoft my perspective of being a public servant and a resident of a city, recipient of public services. And so I recognize and understand very clearly that critical infrastructure is crucial to all parts of our life. And a lot of times we don't see it except when it fails. And this provides us, I think, with a good shorthand for thinking about critical infrastructure. So if it causes a major disruption, right, in your daily life, when it stops working, it's a good sign you might be dealing with critical infrastructure. So when I posed that question recently to some colleagues at Microsoft, we realized that our day-to-day lives rely on 6 or more pieces of critical infrastructure, any of which failing would cause a major disruption to our daily routine. So current events, as Andy just shared and that you as well did, Seth, both weather and climate related, are drawing more and more attention to critical infrastructure in cities. For example, right, both in the US with the Texas grid, the floods in New York City, the floods in Belgium, in 2021, we're not even done with 2021 yet. There are trillions of dollars that are being spent or earmarked to be spent on critical infrastructure upgrades in the coming years. So this means that upgrades to both the physical infrastructure, the concrete, the pipes and cables, and the digital infrastructure, the servers, the connectivity, and the software critical to running and managing them. So I've experienced this firsthand in my former roles in state and local governments, and as someone simply living, as I mentioned, and working in cities. So I know the importance of the task ahead of us, but I also understand that it is making the changes we need. It's not going to be easy. And so nevertheless, these investments are an opportunity to solve problems now while building a strong technological base for the future. Hopefully the next slide shifted. So today, with digital transformation top of mind for many government agencies in the US and through the EU, resiliency and recovery funds, for example, the path forward must entail both consistent investment in the new technologies that improve government services and a simultaneous investment in the top tier security and practices associated. So public sector leaders and the business community must understand that the incentives that they are creating with some of these mandates, so the trade-offs, the expertise that they need to bring into the discussion and decision making to seriously tackle both of these issues. So first, on the incentives points, cybersecurity and resilience aren't always talked about in the same discussion. They are part technology problems, but they're also part human problems. So to build resilience, we need to incentivize workplace activity that aligns with those priorities in government. So for example, are there workplace incentives for continual technological improvement and creating sustainable, secure operations, or just for delivery. So on the second hand, on the trade-offs, right, the most common challenge is thinking about short-term and long-term cost and risk. So if short-term cost considerations drive the discussion, long-term risks are going to crop up. So for example, we've all seen examples when cost cutting in the short term leads to higher long-term costs. And as a former CIO, I understand how within budget constraints, it constrains choices, right? But I cannot stress enough, the importance and the imperative to invest wisely. Investing a little more now will save a lot more in the future. This must be, in my opinion, communicated with clarity to public sector budget and finance teams. And finally, expertise. So when it comes to the intersection of what we call operational technology and information technology, we have to leverage the deep expertise of both sides of the equation. So security and transformation, as I mentioned in critical infrastructure, right? Resilience and security are not often in the same discussion. Neither is IT and OT questions, and we can't leave it to either one of them alone to solve. So bringing in those experts into the planning to make sure that lines of communication are open between them. So including them only at the end when you're ready to implement introduces a lot of risk in the process. So my final slide. So everything I've mentioned up until now, I think is important context and a framework for prioritizing the projects that we have ahead of us. But if we can't put into practice, then we won't make the changes that we need to see. So I'll talk through 3 quick examples, and then I'll hand it off to the next panelist and expert. In New York City, a place near and dear to my heart and to Seth's, we created an effort called NYCX when I was in the mayor's office. And this was a challenge-based framework for public-private partnerships to solve problems. The concept was propose bold ideas that solve for real urban needs, improve the way that people live, and support a thriving economy. And this was in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Citywide, we had 2 different types of challenges. One was citywide challenges that encouraged global entrepreneurs to partner with New York City to propose solutions and deliver groundbreaking, what we thought were groundbreaking business models to transform and improve the way we live. We then had neighborhood community-based challenges that enabled members of New York City communities to voice concerns at a neighborhood and block level and work with entrepreneurs to surface problems, co-create prototype solutions, and apply, test, and grow emerging technologies. Why it worked? Well, the challenge-based structure of the program incentivized companies and entrepreneurs from around the globe to provide specific targeted solutions that met the needs and standards that the city had. The city retained control of what would actually be implemented, and the structure led to quick results that allowed companies to demonstrate the value of their solutions in the real world. So examples of that were an EV charging challenge that we conducted and a cybersecurity solutions for small businesses effort. Next, in the city of Antwerp, the city partnered with B-Mobile, a Microsoft partner and a leader in smart mobility solutions. Together, they built a multimodal mobility platform customized for the city of Antwerp. And the reason that this worked is that it solved a problem for city leaders who were confronted with significant challenges around traffic and road construction prior to the project. It also made things a lot easier for people. For example, car usage for commuting had declined by 10%. And as a result, the system is more efficient and resilient. And finally, in Lillestrøm, the city leveraged Microsoft Azure to enable remote monitoring of its hydro utilities. And it worked because it solved real problems up front, and the larger value was realized over time. So by remotely monitoring and predicting, which pipes or pumps need replacing, staff in the government were more informed and could be more proactive about decisions before sending workers on site. In other words, resources were directed more effectively and save money. And that was an early win the system needed. So now that that is in place, it's also pursuing and improving workforce efficiency and providing a platform for additional data-driven initiatives in the future. So in summary, you can see the common thread, solve problems now, keep your strategy for the future in mind at all times. And this provides, I believe, a pathway to transformation that keeps your requirements and needs at the forefront, but moves quickly as well. So with this kind of framework in place, we can solve the dual problem of speed to transformation and the prioritization of secure and resilient infrastructure. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Fantastic, Jeremy. Thanks so much. You actually did a terrific job in teeing up and segueing to the next presentation, because kind of the points that you were making about speed, scale, and continuity, resilience, and infrastructure. And our next speaker, Peter Hall, I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit. Wood is a big global engineering company, done a lot of thinking about the infrastructure side of things and what this might look to you. So Peter, over to you.
Perfect. And Seth, is that showing all right?
It is. Yep.
Perfect.
It's I can see the slides on the side, so it's not full screen, but they're up.
Yeah, let's make this full screen, hopefully. Actually, I'll pull this over. To work off of what Andy and Jeremy both said, it's actually a great segue into what we're doing at Wood, which is really a reflection of what I think a lot of large engineering construction design firms are doing. And really what I'm going to touch on is right there, how we've developed roadmaps to get the projects built in cities that have to be built. So this is actually a really, if I break it down to sort of why we're doing this within Wood and why the engineering community has to take the data that Andy was talking about, the climate risk data, leverage technology to build projects for cities at scale and at pace that are going to last and now, especially out of COVID, right, really generate equity and social benefits. These are some of the questions that we hear internally at Wood and a lot from our clients, and we're trying to really promote with cities, CROs, and other asset owners and there's many other questions around this, but how do projects contribute to the lives of the communities they serve? That's increasingly a really important question as cities and for businesses. And to touch on what Andy was saying, how vulnerable are projects to future climate impacts? And Andy mentioned, cities, I think, are really looking at flood and sea level rise. We're seeing cities also look a lot at heat is another issue, and also multi-hazard issues. So we do a lot of work helping our clients understand what are the future climate risks and they need to design for, and then getting into how we build the project. So how do we build these projects that deliver the intended outcomes? There's sustainable infrastructure that results in resiliency as the world changes. And then increasingly, we need to help cities and businesses transform projects. So this gets into the idea that we need to do more than just build infrastructure. We need to build infrastructure that can help people live, it can help people transform themselves. And this ties into the whole trend around, this is more on the business side, but ESG reporting, climate risk reporting. I think we'll hear at COP a lot about TNFD, nature-based reporting. So this gets into a lot of what we're hearing in cities, and actually what we're hearing a lot of investors require and ask for, and they're a key lever because they're providing the funding for the projects. This is a very simplistic way that we're now at Wood, and it's really similar to other engineering firms. How we're taking a lot of what Jeremy and Andy and others were talking about, combining the climate data and science and making sure that we build that into our projects early. You can't factor that in once the concrete's poured. Once the project is bid and started, you have to get this in early. So what we do, and this is what a lot of cities, and we're working with cities now to really think closely about this in businesses, but understanding the shocks and stresses, what's your timeline for delivery, what are the things you have to worry about in the future around climate, and also around COVID, equity, changes in economics, and this whole idea that you have to spend time early in projects analyzing data, understand your vulnerability, risks, and it's not just climate data, understand your stakeholders, understand your financial requirements, understand your procurement group so you can get these projects into procurement. And when you analyze data, climate data well, then you can protect, we can build our projects that protect assets, protect people, protect cities, protect businesses, and it's all around reliable performance, enhanced outcomes, making sure our projects can withstand future shocks. this is what we're doing within Wood, and we're a large, in 50 countries, building projects around the world. We're trying to get this through our work into our projects, and we're seeing increasingly cities educating cities too in this whole timeline. And then when we do this, then you can transform cities. Projects can transform people. You have to measure projects, and then you can get a resilience dividend. And one of the ways we're measuring how projects perform, and this work actually came out of an initial concept with the resilience shift a few years ago, and then it got taken up by the Rockefeller Foundation. We built a resilience screen, which basically measures what I just showed. So you can take projects, and we make sure that we look at climate risks, doing a right level of governance, stakeholder engagement, and it actually will rank a project for how well it does it. This screen is actually being used, and this will be announced at COP. Actually, it's already announced, but Rockefeller is doing another announcement on this catalytic capital fund with the hopes to get it to 10 billion for urban resilient infrastructure. In fact, we're doing a workshop with Pidge and Meridian at COP on this. And our screen basically provides the list of bankable projects, or the set of projects that are at a higher level of resilience that can get cities to where they need to be. So it's all about connecting projects to finance. The interesting thing is we've also found cities, and we hope more in the future will use this if they have a number of projects, to select the best projects to build, so it can accelerate projects at pace. So that's, you need to measure what you do. So that's one of the things we're doing. This is a quick overview of the Race to Resilience work that Andy briefly mentioned. On the Race to Resilience work, at its core, what they really want to do is tie businesses, cities, and non-state actors to improving the resiliency of people. So their goal is, improve the resiliency of 4 billion people by 2030. I actually lead the business engagement work. We're very intentionally working with businesses, and cities are using this too, to tie what they do to people. So the idea, and it relates to what I just showed, you have to have a commitment, you have to plan, you have to proceed with that plan, and then you have to measure. And in the white box, this will be announced at COP. It's very early, it's still drafted, but these are the kinds of metrics that the Race to Resilience is trying to get out for impact. How many people can be improved? How many countries, regions? It's kind of a scalable pyramid of impact, and that's what we're trying to get to through a lot of our work. And then takeaways. This is what we're seeing in our work from cities and businesses. They only have a limited amount of money. You have to get it right the first time to build back better. A lot of our clients, they need a roadmap, like I just showed. They need to understand how they can go from start to finish and measure. And then partnerships, absolutely critical. At Wood, we're developing a lot of partnerships, a lot on this call. Without partnerships, there's no way we can build our projects and get them done. So partnerships are going to be just absolutely critical to get this done. And look forward to the Q&A. And thanks, Seth.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate that presentation, and exciting to see the breadth and depth of the perspectives that you're trying to drive through across your business, and then also, very grateful to you, Peter, for kind of the incessant kind of pressure and focus on partnerships and collaborations, and the importance, and all the stuff that you're doing with us at the Climate COP Champions team on the Race to Resilience too. It's tremendous, Peter. So thank you for that. I'd like to, last but certainly not least, come to Jean now. And I think, Jean's got some really fascinating perspectives on the broader picture of things. We've heard now about mobilizing information and data in cities, tech, scalability. We've heard now from Peter about what it looks like to try to translate that into tangible projects. But, Jean, you have this just fascinating perspective, clients that you deal with, and looking at horizon scanning, and what are the risks and what are the problems, and how is the money getting moved or not moved. So really keen to hear your perspectives now from what we've just heard. Over to you, Jean.
Great, thanks, Seth. And yeah, I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. No slides from me, so maybe that will be kind of a gentle transition into the discussion, roundtable discussion as well. Yes, as you mentioned, Seth, I think just to kind of put in context some of the comments that I will make, I've got but maybe 5 or 6 points I want to get across, and keen to hear, you know, some of the reaction and thoughts as well in the discussion. But you are right, we work across all different sectors. We have offices in 37 countries around the world, and we have a strong presence in emerging markets as well as in developed economies. And you know, we're working very directly in helping to build resilience around infrastructure projects, whether that's, you know, the kind of giga projects in Saudi Arabia, looking at risk intelligence frameworks. How do you practically kind of build a framework to be able to understand, adapt, and mitigate those risks, as well as then working with institutional and M&A investors who are looking through a very different lens of what resilience means within the kind of ESG approach. So I wanted to kind of just put that in context, because I think we have seen the needs of multinationals, and I guess, you know, how we have developed as a company ourselves has really been kind of the story of globalization over the past 50 years or so, you know, where that's been kind of foreign investment classically going into new markets and then facing new risks and needing to adapt to those and building resilience in that way. But I think that the kind of pace of change in the last 2 years has just been enormous. And also there are some common challenges that I will point to, but I think one of our kind of key tenets in working with clients is that it's really important to understand the local context as well. What does building resilience mean, you know, at an operational level, in a particular geography or in a particular city? That will vary hugely depending on, you know, whether you're in Lagos or in Shenzhen or in London or in New York. So that's just kind of some context. And, you know, the first point I would make is just from a global perspective, in monitoring principal risks and emerging risks for business, which is how, you know, from a kind of risk point of view, how businesses tend to think about their risks. What are our principal risks? What could really undo our business? You know, commonly, I would say the kind of top 5 there remain geopolitical risk, climate related risk, whether that's physical or transition risk to their business. Also regulatory risks, again, that varies hugely by sector, and cyber risks in particular is very much high on the agenda. But I think it's just worth kind of bearing in mind that, you know, from the point of view of what businesses are living, and I would say also what many kind of political decision makers are living, is still that we really have not moved out of the pandemic yet. If we take a global perspective, I think it's really important to kind of, you know, we call it living in a world with long COVID. We will be living with this for years to come. Vaccination rates are still very low in many countries, particularly in emerging markets. In Africa, is, you know, the kind of most acute, I guess, example of how long it will take to really vaccinate populations. And in the meantime, businesses are having to, you know, continue adjust, but really work in a suboptimal way. And that is important to kind of have in context, because when you're already under that type of kind of strain at an operational level, it just means that any kind of additional crisis, or, you know, having to kind of react quickly to new information, or, you know, floods or crisis or whatever it may be, is all the harder, and we will, and businesses feel that pain, I think, of that going through that transformation. However, I would say on the optimistic side is that our experience is the last 2 years have really forced a reevaluation of priorities. And in some ways, I think that makes the kind of systemic changes that we're talking about today easier in the longer term. And that's really most notable in the kind of urgency with which institutional investors, pension funds, and private equity investors as well are really moving to adapt to a more sustainable approach. I think that's very timely, and probably would not have happened actually without the COVID pandemic in some ways. Just moving into a couple of other key points. I said I was going to be quite short, but whenever I start speaking, I just keep going. I think there's really a long way for businesses to go to embed resilience within business models. So while we have this kind of top-down pressure, you know, actually working through what that means is going to take quite a long time. And if we just look at, you know, the climate risks that we're talking about, that is not mainstreamed within most corporates. There's a huge amount of work to do until it's really well understood. And I think while the realization at a leadership level within businesses is there, and actually, you know, we've seen some businesses really kind of adapting their business models very rapidly to evolve. And you know, it's a great example in the UK is BP. You know, the kind of classic oil company moved to an integrated energy company, completely kind of rethinking its business model for the future. But I think moving beyond the understanding of you know, the kind of environmental impacts, but how these mitigation actions can really be effective, how business models can be adapted. And even in terms of the kind of the risk management frameworks that are used and building in the reality of climate change, there's huge gaps left around skills, processes, and data. And I think to the points that Peter and Jeremy have made, and Annie's comments as well, around the level of data that's becoming available, businesses, you know, have not yet really kind of adapted to even what is potentially kind of available because of how those the kind of complementarity is required to, you know, understand what's there and how you use it. So there's three key gaps that I would call out. One that we see a lot is around emerging risk as a function and how well that is really done within businesses. I think, again, COVID revealed that there was often very little substance to, and maybe kind of more lip service paid at times to what emerging risk management really meant. And that has been recognized as a gap that needs to be filled. So I think, you know, climate risks are not really emerging risks anymore, but the ripple effects of what they will have will remain unpredictable. So building that kind of functional capability throughout the business is one key area that we see as a priority. The second one I would point to is around operational resilience planning. So how do you implement that within your frameworks? I think this varies hugely by industry and by sector. So, you know, I think the key point is that there's a real case for having climate risk understood as a kind of non-technical risk that can be integrated within the ERM frameworks, and this is something that we're very focused on. And I think, you know, it's almost a kind of cultural mindset around how we think about these risks, because of it, you know, it's seen as a kind of specialist subject, and actually a lot of what we're working on is just kind of demystifying that as a subject that can be integrated within existing ERM frameworks. And I think that's very doable, and you know, that's something that we're very focused on. The last comment I want to make around gaps that business faces really around skill sets, and I think a lot of people will kind of I expect this comment will resonate with many people, because it's really hard to grow or upskill internally in some of these areas. And, you know, at the moment, what we're seeing in many markets, and the UK is a good example of that, there's huge competition for talent to really in-house this kind of expertise. And it's hard to get the fit right on that as well, because if you don't know what you're hiring for, or you don't know what you really need, then you don't really know what you're hiring for. And there's a lot of, you know, very painful kind of learning and getting things wrong. But I think, you know, seeing more reliance on that, we've seen a very similar evolution to how cyber emerged as, you know, principal risk 10 years ago. And again, lots of firms kind of really taking time and, you know, a lot of money to figure out what that actually meant for their business. And we see very similar with climate risk at the moment. The last point I want to make is, I mean, there's a couple of other points I'll make hopefully in the discussion, but one is around insurance, which we haven't mentioned yet. But from a business risk point of view, it's just so important that the market can solve the issue and develop capacities that businesses can mitigate some of these emerging risks and climate risk. And obviously there's, you know, there are some early providers of that in the market. You know, there's issues with the level of data availability. The insurance industry will be going through this is looking at innovations, and I think we can expect a kind of transformation in the insurance industry. But at the moment, that's just a real constraint for businesses to manage their risk effectively, because they cannot cover it in the same way that they can cover other risks. I'll draw my comments to a close there, Seth, and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks, Jean. Well, as I predicted, fantastic perspectives, a wealth of knowledge, and it maybe also to note, you guys were perfectly on time in your opening remarks, which means we have ample time for discussion. So I'm going to kind of segue into that now. At the same time, I'd love to get folks listening to throw in questions that I can kind of review on the side and try to incorporate as we go along. But kind of riffing off of a common thread that I've heard here, and also kind of where one of the comments that you made, Jean, that I found particularly interesting, which is it's hard if we don't understand the risk, it's hard to understand the issues, which is then hard to find the right people and then solve for this. And what strikes me is quite interesting is that we're doing this convening in under the auspices of Innovate for Cities, which is trying to figure out how to blend together different perspectives and different types of information to result in actionable data, actionable information and policy in a specific place. And we know that's hard. We know that that's the boundaries of stepping out of the bubble and where the friction points are, and that's where the creation comes from. But it strikes me as it's difficult as cities are trying to grapple and figure this out, businesses are trying to do that, a broader civil society, and then we're trying to mash them all together to do that in real time. That could be pretty complicated. So I think with that in mind, I'd like maybe to come back to where we started, Andy, with you. And talk about the underpinnings of Innovate for Cities, how it's trying to bring this together, but also tease out some of these other issues. And in particularly, I thought it was interesting, Jean talking about the problems in private companies, and I totally agree, haven't kind of embedded those processes themselves. But on the flip side of that, what's interesting about cities, not that cities fully understand the magnitude and the scope and the detail of the risks they're facing up, but cities are experts in emergency management. Cities manage police, they manage emergencies constantly, and they're very, very good at this, but need to get better at the proactive and the avoidance and some of the things Jeremy said about the upfront investments to ensure that they don't have to be constantly in the reactive state. So over to you, Andy, and then we'll cycle through a couple of other speakers and also scan. So if you guys want to jump in off of somebody else that one of your fellow panelists is saying, I'll keep scanning and we'll move around pretty fluidly. Andy, over to you.
Thank you, and I'll jump around there a little bit. I did want to also come back on the point about, to your point about embedding those responses within businesses and cities, also to the point that was made about doing that early enough in the project lifecycle. And you'll know that we've been working with World Bank and European Investment Bank and other partners on the City Climate Finance Gap Fund. And really some of the work that's looking to support is to embed some of these considerations at pre-feasibility or feasibility stage when projects are being thought about. So there are now many thousands of cities with climate action plans that incorporate considerations of adaptation. And really now it's about advancing projects from those plans towards implementation and investment, which, in your opening remarks is kind of part of the theme for this whole session. But really, it's been great to be able to work with you and other colleagues who are on the call through the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. Peter mentioned them and has been engaged in the work of the Finance Action Track there, just to think about how we embed and start to realize that. And the role of the kind of consulting engineering community in both advising cities on that response at individual project level, and finding the right way to kind of play that in as we're moving from a citywide climate action plan to then implementation of individual responses, whether that's on the emissions reduction side or the straight kind of climate adaptation, climate resilience response side, is really key. and in other sessions this week, we've kind of published and announced a new white paper on the role of pre-development finance or project development facilities, pre-feasibility stage work, in opening up the opportunity to do that. And I'm not suggesting it's the entire answer, but one way to kind of bring businesses and cities together, is in that pre-feasibility stage. One of the recommendations that ICSE white paper makes is for greater community consultation and engagement at that early stage of project preparation and appraisal. And as I'm sure many of the people kind of listening will appreciate, kind of doing that and embedding that early enough, and with that wide consultation, it enables some of those additional life cycle factors that kind of Peter focused on and others have mentioned, to then be integrated into project thinking. So I think there's some really important work, but also some key mechanisms that we're starting to understand, but we need to scale, and not just like 2 or 3-fold, like orders of magnitude, more technical assistance and support to now be able to use some of these facilities really properly to try to embed those considerations early enough. And then to the point about insurance, the only other thing I'd say in terms of both Innovate for Cities and some of the other global covenant work on finance. Thanks for raising the point, Jean. Really valuable. A key mechanism, and we're only just starting to understand that. But again, actually the ICSE through their innovation track work is starting to look at innovative financing mechanisms and to investigate possibilities around insurance funding and financing. And it will be really interesting to be able to draw that back in and to share some of that experience with municipal leaders through the Global Covenant.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, and we're hearing more and more, as you were saying, and I think this is emerging in many organizations, the kind of broader kind of stakeholder community base, which provides more. It helps de-risk things. It helps to get in other perspectives, but in many ways, they're also slow moving. They're also unwieldy and hard to manage. And in a business profit ROI kind of driven society, we don't do those things because they're longer, slower, and more costly. Right. So maybe with that, but we know we need to do it. And I think it's this shift again in understanding that there's these upfront efforts, costs, and time that are well worth it, because then they avoid all these other downstream issues. So Jeremy, with that in mind, coming to you, are there key technologies that can help future-proof these processes, these infrastructures? Because in going bigger and wider into the scale that we're talking about, we also have to find ways to create those efficiencies. It's been interesting to see how global work practices have radically shifted in a year and a half from working from home. And a lot of the things that we didn't think were really possible have become normal. So maybe some thoughts from your perspective on that, Jeremy.
Yeah, sure. And I want to just build off of what you said before around cities being experts in emergency response and preparedness. And so, the way I look at this is that, as a former city, leader, the public sector obligations and challenges, I think there are 3 at least related to this conversation when it comes to sustainability and resilience. Protecting life and property, making informed decisions, and showing leadership on meeting environmental targets, right? So we know on the first point, protecting life and property, these climate and weather events, right? We don't need to continue to kind of discuss that ad nauseum. We know the issues are there. They're continuing to present immediate threats to life and property. But decision makers, need accurate, timely data that can be collaboratively shared and reviewed to make evidence-driven decisions and analyze their success. And in terms of showing leadership on meeting environmental targets, it's often hampered by public sector and city leadership by siloed agencies, right? Data and communications and the ability to visualize the data effectively. And so in terms of future proofing and those investments in terms of the critical infrastructure, so that it remains resilient and secure in those operations and the response that we're talking about for those threats today and those that are down the road, Certainly, cloud platforms, right? It's been said a million times, but it has become a common refrain for a reason. And one of the primary benefits of cloud adoption and platforms like Azure is the commitment that comes along with them to continue to be developed in the future, right? They're elastic, right? You can look at a cloud solution and say, we know that we can turn it up or turn it down depending on the timing and what we need in that exact moment. So a counter example to that, like, I get it, we know resources are constrained, but a fully on-prem data center, let's say, even a state-of-the-art one, is eventually going to need to be upgraded. And it will require lots and lots of time, skills, money, and investment to do so. And so, although, right, as a former CIO, I understand the appeal of keeping everything in-house, I also know it has its own issues that are sometimes really underappreciated at the outset of this project. So cloud really does address those issues by leaning into the provider's commitments to expertise and security, especially. And I think the security piece that kind of ties into it is on the zero trust side of this, right? It's a framework, not a single technology, but it fits the bill here, I believe. And so one of the challenges with a security policy in the public sector is the need to consistently play catch up, right? And zero trust has the potential to break out of that cycle by being flexible enough to work with future technologies and the present ones. So governments, I think today, public sector entities have the opportunity to tackle those three issues I mapped out at the start, to use the money strategically from the infrastructure dollars that are coming and flowing in to solve the immediate problems, building and investing in some of these technologies while building toward those longer term goals. And so it's not always, as I think you and I relate, and the folks on this call will relate, it's people, process, and technology, right? So you've got to have the right people, you've got to have the processes in place to be able to enable the technology to do these things, to solve the problems that we have. So certainly in practice, it's a journey to do these things, but there's no better time than now to do that and take advantage of what's been what's happened and what's been established over the last 18 plus months.
Yeah, fantastic, Jeremy. And I want to stick with you for a minute too, because talking about some of the opportunities of cloud working together, breaking down, in this case, not physical silos in terms of city departments, but digital silos. And sticking with this for a moment, it's interesting to understand that even though we're kind of in a more advanced place than we've ever been in terms of society about how easy it is to move information around, access information, move goods and services. Most people don't realize that most cities, regardless of global north, global south, are still in an analog world. They are not in a digital world. And what's been interesting is the ability to say, not that I disagree with you about cloud solutions and the type of flexible platforms, but there wasn't a big lurch forward in some of the wealthier cities in the world and investing in moving from analog to digital. And what happened is we replicated the same mistakes because they bought into hardware that was specific to a company. And then what happened is that individual departments within cities made those infrastructure investments in data, but they did not interoperate with other departments. So they made that switch to digital, but then the digital format didn't happen. And now on a cloud platform, yes, we have the ability to perhaps do a more plug and play, but maybe some thoughts and reflections, because we do need to make steps, we do need to make advancements, but we need to recognize when things aren't working. And then your connection, I loved your connection about the individuals, the processes, and the technology. But if they don't sync up, it's still not going to work. And how do we rapidly, and from your experience as a COI, how do you rapidly evolve something that's brand new from a city? We're making an investment that we haven't made. We totally don't get this. Now departments are shifting line budgets and they're developing staff and careers on it. And then, oops, we got it wrong. We need to evolve it. Some thoughts on that?
Oh, it's so tough. It's so hard. But part of this is partnerships. I mean, there's the public and private kind of pieces to this, right? Where you certainly you should leverage and utilize the people and the human capital that you have around you in your ecosystem. That is government, that is universities, that is industry, that is the startup community. Those are people who are willing and eager to want to tackle really, really kind of gnarly problems. So the partnership piece is one, but it really fundamentally, from my view, comes down to the leadership right? The executive buy-in in a mayor's office or a governor's office or the elected official's office, right? They're motivated by reelection, right? And so the things that don't get them reelected are failures or things that break down, things that get them the negative publicity and press. And so when we look at technology and bringing in the sharp minds and people that can help to kind of both think about the frameworks and then think about the deployments of the things we want to do and the training of the workforce, you've got to have the experts, the technology folks at the table in the room when these things are being discussed and thought through deeply. I've seen what happens when you don't have the technologists in the room for those things and decisions are made, right? And you ship code out and the product isn't ready, or you design an application that you believe will provide a service, but it doesn't meet the need of the person, right? Where the actual individual who benefits and needs that service to gain access to, food services or mobility or transportation services, when it breaks, when those things don't work, because often the decisions are made without the technology person at the table, from someone who doesn't know about the actual problem, and certainly without the perspective of the person, right, that these services is supposed to benefit. So there's a lot within that to think about, and meeting each and every agency, each government where they are in their journey to kind of transform or transition from some of the technologies they have. That's a real journey and a roll up the sleeves opportunity that requires, I think, some of the partnership things I said at the start.
I love that, Jeremy, about where people are, where cities are, where organizations are in that journey. And I think we often try to keep compartmentalizing things and put it on this nice, neat, kind of clean, linear path, and it doesn't work that way. So I'm gonna come to Peter, put Peter in a hot seat a little bit, because we're talking about information, data. I loved all the points that you made, but we also have to recognize that more than half of the world's population doesn't live in an environment where they even have data, right? Global South is informal settlements. They don't even have zip codes. There's no addresses. There's no block and lots. It's informal settlements that you don't have access to data. Forget about analog. So in that context, Peters, we're trying to build infrastructures. We're trying to learn from the mistakes that we've made in the heavily industrialized global North. How do we work in a totally different way in the global South? And when there's a totally different level of data, there's a totally different speed with which urbanization, inequity is ever. And in particular, when we're talking about capacity issues, you're doing so much, as you explained, within Wood on retrenching Wood's perspectives and understanding of resilience, but you also need to service clients who need those issues and understanding, and some of the gaps that we have between where the expertise is in a large consulting firm to a city a place that might need it, like a city, but doesn't have the mechanisms with which to unlock that information without a conflict of interest, right? A city writes an RFP, say, this is what we want, and then you respond to that RFP and you go build the project. But if you're in the global South and you don't have the data to understand and write a really technically sound RFP, a company isn't going to bid on it. And in order to help them do that, you're not going to get paid for that. And in fact, if you did help them give that advice, you might be precluded from actually bidding on the project to make the money that you need. This sounds like a pretty vicious cycle, Peter. So what's your thoughts about this, and how is Wood engaging in this issue?
Great question, Seth. So a couple initial thoughts. Completely spot on. I mean, we do a lot of work, admittedly, in the Americas, in developed countries. So, in the emerging markets, which actually need a critical infrastructure, we're seeing this in the race to resilience. Those are the countries, global South, that need the critical infrastructure projects. One of the things we're doing, and certainly I'm seeing, is the ability to, mention before, scale. So as we build projects, whether it's water, power, you mentioned power systems, water systems, basic transportation. It could be food related projects in cities. One of the things we're doing is, and I think is a trend in a lot of firms, is you get it right, you get efficient in the developed countries or cities, but when you bring it to the global South, and I think Gene touched on this, or someone did. You need to have local resources. So, I mean, we can't, as a firm, go into an area if we don't have an office, we don't have people. So it really puts a lot of pressure on us to have local resources, local networks that can help us leverage technologies and work with the cities. That's where we bring in a lot of partnerships with Resilient Cities Network, mostly, to be honest, but also looking at C40, WRI, ICLEI does all this work, trying to find good local partners on the ground that can help us do this work. You mentioned one of the issues around bidding. One of the things we did early on, and everyone's touched on this, the cities have strategies, especially the advanced cities that are really getting this. They have strategies. They still really struggle building the right projects off those strategies, implementing their strategies. One of the things we've done is work with cities to basically do pilot projects that can show results, that can quickly get projects smaller scale out of pre-feasibility that build. The trick for us and everyone, though, is you can't go too far where you can. Then when they bid out a larger project, you can't do the work. So we're always looking at that line where we advise and help, but don't go too far so we can't do the work. I will say this, though, there's so many cities that need this work that if we can advance work, and we have in some cities, we don't necessarily have to do the follow-on work in that city, because the other thing we've done is if it's worked in a city, especially in the Global South, you can do the same thing in another city. So you can use that expertise to bid that work in other cities. So that's another piece we're working at. And the other thing somewhat related to this on the measurement side is that resilience lens that I mentioned. What we're seeing a lot of cities now, and this really relates to the Global South directly, is we need to make sure that our infrastructure projects tie to people. How can our projects really help vulnerable people and provide those critical services? So we're actually doing some work now that we hope to enhance at COP2, where we have a whole component on equity in that resilience lens. So when you do a project, and in fact, I saw one of the notes in the chat about that. So looking at, does it address vulnerable populations? Does it improve access to healthcare? Can it, improve access to food, medical? Can it create jobs? So, and we're starting to work with other social finance, social type firms to get a handle on that. And that's actually part of, answer your question, Seth, that's part of it too, is we do have to think a little differently when we do projects in the Global South rather than projects in the US. And we're working closely on that. The one thing too, related to, I think, Gene's comment, within Wood, it's interesting. We've actually reshifted the whole company around sustainable infrastructure, energy, digital, Jeremy. So we have to tie digital. In fact, we partnered with Microsoft on this, is digital into everything we do early on. And the last one's future workforce. So how do we attract, retain the workforce of tomorrow for this work? And as Gene mentioned, we have to know where our gaps are, what they need. And that actually also is the answer part of your question, Seth, is we need to have the right skill set for different markets on our side too.
Yeah, no, terrific, Peter. Yeah, that was not an easy question I sent your way, and that was a really thoughtful answer on a number of fronts. And Tanya, you mentioned, you touched on, I think it was Alistair in the chat had mentioned something about how are we measuring understanding inequality, but also the measuring kind of the connectivity of what this infrastructure is doing. And I appreciate you touching on those. Miriam also in the chat was talking about leadership. So I wanted to come back to Gene, all of you, but in particular Gene first. Everybody else wants to jump in on this, but what's happening for the transformation of leadership, and why I thought of coming back to you on that, Gene, is that you had mentioned in your observation of your clients and stuff that some of these issues aren't getting embedded in the organizations systemically yet, but you are seeing, you remarked that you are seeing and a growing awareness at the leadership level of these companies that this is important, and now needing to begin to move in a different direction and restructure their businesses. Some thoughts on anecdotes or observations or things that you've seen in courageous leadership, and in particular that this Miriam's question really resonates with me quite a lot in the face of COVID. Unprecedented in most kind of leaders' lifetime. a lot of unknowns and a lot of mistakes. So that level of uncertainty, how do you make courageous decisions that are transformational? Over to you, Gene, and I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a great question. I love that question. And I love that we're talking about leadership because, my background and training is actually as a political analyst. So, I feel it's really important to understanding how things really get done. The importance of quality leadership is often underestimated. But I thought it was really interesting, just coming back to something what Jeremy said about understanding kind of how things happen from the top down and how important it is to have leaders buy in around the transformation agenda. And it's very, it's there's a direct parallel there to businesses. So I think we talk about, if you think about kind of a business that is run well, that has good corporate governance, obviously there's the regulatory frameworks around that will vary, but this comes back to kind of key principles. Companies should be focused on a purpose. They should have values that align with that purpose. Their strategy should also be aligned, and the culture should support that. And leadership is a huge part of kind of driving what that culture is. And I think we have seen through COVID, it has come under pressure, and that's really been kind of very directly, governance is always tested in a crisis, and I think that's been visible, in how businesses have actually reacted in terms of share prices and where there have been, real difficulties within the business model that has been shown up. But I think what can we do in terms of training and cultivating good better leadership, I suppose, to deal with these challenges. And there's kind of two, just coming back to kind of the parallels that Jeremy drew, what do leaders want to do? If you're a mayor, you want to get reelected. If you're a leader in a business, you might be there for lots of different reasons, but there's a personal agenda, there's a professional agenda. And actually the top-down pressure that we're seeing on leaders to change, because to be able to remain a going concern and achieve their company's purpose, they have to change. When they're going out to refinance, they're getting asked a whole new set of questions. When they're going out to raise capital in markets, they need to be able to kind of answer again, lots of different disclosures that are kind of being forced upon the business, and is forcing a change in leadership, I think. And we'll see that, we'll see greater divergence, I think, in leaders that are adapting to that and being able to respond to that just through market mechanisms. The other thing that we haven't touched on quite so much, but I think we see as very important for a leadership change, is also the change that's coming from within the workforce and within the business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of mantra that we tend to kind of have around this, and a lot of our clients, who I'd say are more forward thinking on it, is that activists are your employees. Your workforce incorporates all the views that are in society, and that is so fundamental for leaders to really recognize and kind of integrate within their thinking. And because when that's done well, that is very empowering for business success. That really is where you're able to kind of build a really positive organizational culture, and that is so fundamental to ultimately a resilient business model. Because you are in most businesses, you are, and people are absolutely kind of at the core of that. And I think that's where we see, maybe again, kind of in terms of different performers, the leadership mindset that is open to engaging with that in a kind of constructive way and an innovative way, will continue to outperform. And where there's more kind of cultural resistance to that, or seeing that as kind of an area of risk, or not kind of meriting leadership attention or investment, we expect we will continue to see those businesses probably underperform, because they'll be slower to adapt, and they'll be slower to make the changes needed. So I think a really good question on leadership, and I'm interested to hear the other perspectives, particularly Jeremy. I'm sure you've got some great examples to draw on from your past lives.
Yeah, Gene, I loved those insights and comments, and particularly that some of the changes in market pressures and financial flows are going to start dictating a new crop or a new era of leadership. I hadn't thought about it that way. Fascinating. But at the same time, I'm much more attuned to kind of the grassroots, what's coming up from the activism side, the citizen side, but also the financial flows are also dictating that on the other side. Fascinating insight. I want to go to actually Andy next, because a lot of what's been happening in the city space is, right, a cultivation of leadership from cities, but in a different way, right? The climate crisis it was this big global commons issue. I've been elected to take care of, as Jeremy and I were talking about, the issues and the stresses and the livelihood of people and goods and services in my city. Like the broader world is not my problem. So this is the kind of, think global, act local. And cities have completely emerged onto the space that this is a global commons problem that is our problem to solve. So kind of ushering in a whole new level of global leadership from the mayoral level. Well, how is that, Andy? In running up the COP now in, 2-3 weeks away, national governments, intergovernmental negotiations still lagging behind where it needs to be, cities kind of continuing to run out in front, but are they tiring? Are they running into barriers? What's the evolution of leadership from the city perspective, Andy?
So thank you very much for the question. Couple of reflections. One has been that no city leader wants to feel alone. And there is a role for networks in being able to link both like-minded leaders, but then also officials backing them together. If mayors are going to stick their neck out and introduce, kind of potentially controversial, it seems to be the case, particularly with transport, right? We saw it with, Mayor Livingston in London and the introduction of the congestion charge. Everybody thought that would make him unelectable. Turned out not to be the case. Some of the work that Mayor Hidalgo had done in Paris on the pedestrianisation of the right bank of the Seine, then controversial, but became politically palatable. And some of these leaders, then can both act as inspiration for others. And there is then a role for the Global Covenant and many other networks in helping individual mayors not to feel alone and isolated, to help to link them together with fellow leaders who are trying to act in this space, and to drive forward that ambition. And to your point, and there are two schools of thought emerging with regards to COP26. One is that, reporting in UK media in the last few days that John Kerry was coming out and saying some very useful things. Things were starting to move in the right direction. Then followed the very next day by announcements about what was happening from national leadership in China. And then just yesterday by the World Energy Outlook from IEA. I described one of the graphs from one of the IEA team earlier in the week during the Innovate for Cities conference as the most depressing chart of the week, showing kind of energy use and emissions rebound, as we stand currently, and that latest analysis from the IEA as indicating that we're delivering anything but a green recovery at the moment, to be brutally frank about it. And as the World Energy Outlook is kind of providing that pathway to net zero for national governments, absolutely the messaging from the Global Covenant and others at COP26 in Glasgow will be that cities are going further and faster than many national governments, and are working towards net zero. And demonstrating that actions are being delivered on the ground in ways that national governments aren't. It's still been the perennial call that there should be greater access for cities to direct access to both recovery funding, to some of the multilateral lending that's always directed through or mandated by national governments. And we know from individual cities that national governments can be blockers on some of those things, because nothing happens with some of the multilateral lending institutions without the Minister of Finance saying that's okay. So impression at the moment, certainly from our experience, would be that kind of the city action planning is progressing and progressing rapidly. I don't think city leaders have yet been kind of beaten down, and I still think you'll see a great number kind of come forward at COP26 with very clear demonstrations, both of individual kind of project level work, but also citywide commitments to Race to Zero, to Race to Resilience, to other programs, and again repeating those calls for a bigger role and a kind of enhanced seat at the table.
Thanks, Andy. Heartening to hear. We're getting close to near the end of this session, but I want to hear from Peter and Jeremy both on this leadership question. So try to keep your remarks to no more than 2 minutes. Peter, I'm going to go to you first, and then I'm going to go to Jeremy. Peter, I'm really interested about, I'm fortunate to understand how much work you've been doing to change and bring a new level of leadership and visibility within one of the largest engineering companies in the world, Wood. And you're also privileged to be sitting in the middle of the Climate COP Champions team, working across all the businesses. So I'm very keen to hear from you on the leadership component there. And then Jeremy, just to tee you up on your side, I'm really interested in early adoption of leaders in terms of new technology, new ways of doing business, of what that looks like in one of the largest cities in the world, and now one of the largest private sector tech companies in the world. So Peter, over to you, and then to Jeremy.
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep it. So it's really interesting, Seth. I mean, to Gene's point, Wood is, we're a huge company, and to be frank, we're an oil and gas company, and we've completely pivoted around renewable energy, sustainable infrastructure. That took bold leadership. Sometimes it takes a while to get people, and the CEO I work for, literally said, we're gonna just change the company. And so it's leaders that take a risk. A lot of this came out of, we did scenario planning. So it relates on where the company is going to be in 10 years, but where our workforce is going to be from. So we did scenario planning around energy and infrastructure, what it's going to look like by 2030. That work then literally framed how we changed as a company. How are we going to change as a company? Came from the start. I did a lot of work with our board of directors, working through them. A lot of our change came from investors. One of the top 2 or 3 questions every investors day twice a year is, what's your stance on climate? Have you done a TCFD? What are you doing for ESG? So when it comes from our investors, our leaders get it. The challenge for us, and this is where one of my jobs is to operationalize our strategy, is it's great when the leaders say, you got to have that. But now how do we get it to the mid-level managers, and how do we get it down to the workforce? There's still a gap, and we have 40,000 employees. There's a gap between any company, or even at a city level, saying we're going to do this, and then getting it down to the mid to lower levels that do the work. So that's a challenge, but it's got to start from the top. And I'm working on some things now around academies, trying to get younger workforces, as Seth knows, younger employees involved in some of these exciting projects. The challenge is, once they start, they don't want to go back to what they worked on before.
Yeah.
But we're trying to change the culture on that. And then within the Climate Champions team, we're small. We're like 15 people. So the leadership, crystal clear, doing great work, but we need to then have clear roadmaps that we can go out to businesses, cities, non-state actors, partners, and say, this is where you got to get to. This is how you get there. And almost in a way, like, deputize them to go back into their businesses and find their leaders that will do it. So it's a challenge, but we're getting there. And it did start with our leadership completely pivoting and being pretty courageous.
Peter, thanks for that. It's a very powerful testimony. Jeremy, over to you.
Sure. I'll try and do my best to go with a high note while talking about something that is obviously a struggle.
Yeah.
And we've been kind of going through this throughout trust in general, right? Trust, right, in government and public sector is, and bear with me on this, I'll answer your question. With few exceptions, trust has been declining, right, for decades in government. And even aside from like very high profile kind of one-off failures or cyber incidents or ransom events, there are, I believe, kind of systemic drivers of mistrust that undermine public perception, right, of leadership and government. And so getting services, right, is difficult and time consuming often. And the way government works is often inscrutable. And I've been there, so I take the blame for that too. And governments spend a lot of money, and the payoff is often very difficult for the public to see. And no one thing, no one solution, right, is going to kind of restore that trust. However, governments, public sector can use technology to meet people where they are and serve people better in their real lives. So, making those successes visible, right, in terms of thinking about it from the adoption standpoint, the government, elected leader, the person who makes those decisions, what research and polling shows is that, the closer you are to government, the closer government is to people, the more it is trusted. And local governments are therefore trusted more than your state or your federal or national government, which are in turn, which in turn says like meeting people where they are is not just a turn phrase, right? And so it's a literal necessity. So in my view, as we think about that question about leadership transformation or adoption of technologies, bringing electeds, bringing government as close as possible to the people, which can be daunting and scary and uncomfortable. But guess what? When you sign up for that work, you're a public servant. That is what it requires. And so to me, that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where you have to begin to restore that trust. And it's not for all. We clearly know that. But that's the long-term journey of kind of what it takes. Is the underlying foundation is the trust piece there before you adopt any of these technologies.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. And I mean, that's a wrap. I mean, what a great way to end. Leadership, trust. I want to kind of quickly thank you all for the leadership and the work that you're all doing, bringing some of those examples and highlights to this. Thanks to Innovate for Cities for hosting this, for pulling it together, particularly the Global Covenant of Mayors, UN Habitat, and the IPCC. And very grateful that we were able to spend some time and the great questions from the participants and the panelists as well. So thanks again. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and keep up the great work.
Thank you.